Hello mate, and welcome back to another exciting video. In this one we're going to talk about render settings. We're going to revisit the subject that I've covered a few times before. Before we get started, a huge thank you to everybody for subscribing and hitting the notification icon. That really helps me out, and of course an even bigger thank you to my members and patrons. Your names will be running across the screen at the end of the video. So let's jump into this then. Let's just start off with our general tab, and at the top here you can see that there is a filter. There are not so many properties in this particular pane that require you to use a filter, but in some cases you might just be having a bit of a bad day and just need to find a property specifically. So at the top here you can see that we have presets, editor, and advanced. If we go into presets, it's got a list of presets that have been installed by various different products, as different scenes may require different sets of render settings. However, generally speaking, I can tell you very rarely do I ever go into this tab. In fact, I don't think I've ever actually used it for a final render ever. The first place that you want to be really is in your editor tab, and as we can see, I can open up that and I can select different parts or different subcategories, but realistically there's not that much going on here. So you can see that I've currently got custom sets here, but what you can do is drop this drop down menu down, and then you can see that there's a whole bunch of different presets that are already programmed into Daz Studio, including 720, 1080p, 2K and 4K. So you know, plenty of options there to choose from, or alternatively you can set your pixel size in, and you can also choose your aspect ratio. You know, generally 16:9 is the one that I would go with, but if you wanted to mimic a DSLR, then it would be 2:3. That's the dimensions of a 30mm camera output images. Then we've got constrain global proportions. If you turn that off, then you can adjust these values individually or independent of each other, whereas if you have that selected on, then putting these values in will automatically change all the rest of them. Next thing you have is the render type, and if I drop down this menu you can see that I have a still image for the current frame, image series and movie. Now image series and movie are basically the same thing in terms of they're both for animation. The difference is that image series will quite literally just render a bunch of images which you can then use to frame animate in another piece of software, and movie will do the hard work for you, and it will combine all of the images into a movie and just output an AVI file. Nice and simple. Up to you which one you use. I have used both for various different things, but generally speaking Daz Studio sucks when it comes to animation, so I generally recommend avoiding trying it anyway. So yeah. Now, render target, you can optionally have new window or direct to file. I always use new window because I want to see what I've rendered before I save it. If you go direct to file, it won't show you the output render. It will just write it to a file, which means that you have no idea whether it's finished, when it's cooked, what stage it's at. Quite often I will stop a render at 50% because it's good enough for me to go into post-processing with. So having new window is very helpful. However, if you just want to fire and forget, you don't want to have to sit and watch your window, you've got other things you want to do, then stick it on right to file. Next thing, you can give it a name. Now again, if you're doing right to file, you need to input a name here. If you're doing new window, you don't, because you can give it a name before you save it. So if you're doing right to file, you have to put in the name here, and then image path is where you're going to save it. Again, if you're using rights to new window, you don't have to have anything in here because you get to choose it when you save the image. However, if you're doing right to file, you need to put this information in there. The next two things, auto headlamp, always have that set to never. Never ever ever, and I repeat ever, use auto headlamp. It makes your images look ugly, unprofessional, and you can spot the people who don't do that a mile away, and it just makes them look amateurish. So always have auto headlamp turned off. Use proper in-scene lighting to light your scene. Don't use the camera headlamp, it's awful. And then you've got different post-processing scripts that you can buy, download, whatever. In here, again, I never ever use them. I do all my post work manually after the fact. So that is our general tab. The next one is render mode, and you've only got a few options here. In fact, you've only got two: photoreal and interactive. Generally speaking, leave it on photoreal, move on. Progressive rendering is the next one that we are interested in. Now, there are different categories in here, but again, there are not so many properties that we need to actually mess around with this. Minimum update samples is how often, if you are rendering to file or if you're rendering to screen, is how often it will update the data that's presented on the screen, or how often the data is written to the file. Now, you don't want this update interval in seconds or a minimum update samples to be so frequent that it's constantly writing to disk. Realistically, what you want to do is have this set to a number that is going to mean that it's not going to write to file or to the screen until it's worth it. By which I mean, if I was to do a render now, every 5 seconds, the render that was presented on my screen would be updated with the current information that the render engine has. If I'm doing that write to file, that means every 5 seconds it's going to resave that file, even if nothing has changed. I think you can agree that that's not necessarily acceptable, because obviously if you're using an SSD, read-write operations are a precious commodity, and it can slow down your system as well, particularly if you're working with a particularly large image. So minimum update samples is how many samples does Daz Studio or does Iray have to have completed before it saves the file or writes to the screen at all. Currently it's set to 1, that's the default, but that's not a problem. 5 seconds is the update interval. Any more than that, I would say, would be being excessive, but at the same time, you could quite happily go up to something like 5, 10, 15, 20, and it wouldn't make that much of a difference. Again, what you're trying to do is minimize the amount of work that your system is having to do so that it can dedicate more time and energy working on the actual rendering itself. Minimum number of samples and maximum number of samples. The minimum number of samples and maximum number of samples should be fairly self-explanatory. However, just for those people who really are struggling with this concept, minimum number of samples is the minimum number of times that Iray will iterate through the image, i.e. how many times it will cast the rays and draw the image on the screen before it's allowed to stop, i.e. it will go to 5 in this case before you can do anything. That's the minimum number of samples. The maximum number of samples is far more important, and this can make or break your render. There's been more than one occasion where I've created a scene, started a render, maybe it's a dark scene that requires a little bit more time to render, and I've forgotten to change the max samples, and then it stopped after an hour, or in this case probably less than that, probably about 15 minutes, and I haven't noticed, so I've gone to bed or something like that, blissfully unaware, still thinking that I'm going to come back and see a perfectly finished render, and it looks like garbage because it hasn't rendered enough. The max number of samples is the point at which your render will stop. Now, 5,000 samples for some scenes is a lot. However, for complex scenes, it's not a lot. So I recommend, if you're going to do a scene, any scene at all, you can just crank this up to 15,000 and let it run. The render engine will stop when it gets to 15,000, but you can keep checking up on it if you want to and change that if you want to. If you feel like the render is done before then, stop it. Nothing's stopping you from finishing the render early. But you can't continue a render once it's stopped. So set that high. Same with max time in seconds. Max time in seconds, as you can see, 7,200 seconds is not that long. In fact, it's 15 minutes. No, 12 minutes. If you want to make that longer, drag it all the way up to the end, and then it won't time out before it gets to the end of the render. So those two properties are things that you definitely want to keep an eye on, particularly if you're doing complex renders. Rendering quality enable. If I turn that off, you can see that half the properties from the bottom have disappeared. We turn that on. Basically what this enables us to do is going to enable us to set the quality of the render and rendered converged ratio, i.e. we're telling Daz Studio at the moment that once it gets to 95% convergence, i.e. how close to photorealistic or to the final image it is supposed to be, then it will be fine to finish. I always generally crank that up to 100 and leave it If it's not quite finished, it won't finish. Some people said it's a 99 because there are, stories going around about how it can never reach 100% convergence. Do you know, honestly, I cannot remember if I've ever seen it get to 100% or not. I'm the kind of person who I'll crank it up to 100, and then if it's finished, it's finished. If it's not, it's not. It's one of those things. I genuinely cannot comment on whether or not that rumor is true because I can't remember. It's just one of those things. And then post SSIM is, again, just don't worry about that. Honestly, if you're just looking to get started with Daz Studio, just concentrate on the properties that I'm talking about. This other stuff is just bump that you don't need. Alpha, don't worry about. Optimization. This one you probably will end up playing with for no reason other than sometimes your eyes are going to have black rings in them. As in the eyeballs, around the outside of the irises, you're going to notice that there's black rings. Bits of the eyes are going to be black. And you might have to change your instancing optimization from auto to speed or memory. Changing it often gets rid of that problem, and then you'll be able to get a decent render. So realistically, that's the only time you're going to come in here. Caustic Sampler is supposed to make the rendering of glass objects like vases and bowls and things that actually split the light into its constituent colors. However, to be honest, if you're doing fine art renders and you're literally just doing one render for the sake of doing one render, then you might need to use that. But again, for someone like me who pumps out a number of renders each day, I can't honestly say I've ever used a caustic sampler. So genuinely, probably only instancing optimization you're going to be interested with on this. Leave ray tracing low memory on if you're using a ray tracing graphics card. If not, then don't even worry about that one. Filtering is another one. Now, I always have my Firefly filter enable on, simply because it gets rid of those annoying little orange dots that appear all over the screen, or not all of them, but most of them. And the only other things that I ever really tend to play with is the bloom, and generally speaking, I don't really touch that either. It's easier to put bloom in post than it is to get Daz Studio to do it for you, because it's much easier to make it exactly as you want it to in something like Photoshop than using trial and error trying to figure out what your bloom filter and these settings need to be, because once you enable it, you have to choose what the radius is, what the threshold and the brightness scale are, and it's a crapshoot, realistically, because iRay has a mind of its own sometimes. So generally speaking, I leave that off. I will never ever use post denoiser, and I will never advise anyone to use it. It is dog crap. Don't use it. Just let your renders run properly, give them the time that they deserve, and if you're really struggling, use a proper AI denoiser. But again, I will strongly advise against doing that, purely because it does take detail out of the image. The best thing to do is manual oversampling, which is where you render the image larger than you need it to be, and then when you shrink it down to the size that it's meant to be, a lot of the noise disappears. Nifty little trick, better than using post denoiser. Post denoiser is crap, post denoiser is crap. Okay, moving on. Spectral rendering, never touch it. To be honest, I can honestly say I have never interfered with these settings to make any of my content. It has probably got loads of really cool stuff in there, but I just have never bothered with it because I've never needed to. Section objects, same thing again, never really bothered with that. Tone mapping is where Daz Studio pretends to be a DSLR, essentially. There are other controls in here, but ultimately what you've got is exposure value, EV, you've got shutter speed, f-stop, and film ISO. Now these three settings are the ones that try to emulate what happens in a DSLR. And if you want to know more about that stuff, check out a video on the YouTube. Just do a search on the exposure triangle. Essentially, and I'm not going to explain this in any real depth, there are three ways that light can get into your camera, or there are three ways that you can adjust the amount of light that gets into your camera and onto the sensor at the back. The first thing you can do is change how long the shutter is open for in seconds. So 1/128 is Daz's default. So for example, when you're watching TV, that's 30 frames a second. So, or if you've got a posh TV, maybe 60 or 120. So if you wanted to make it 60 Hertz, you just change that number to 60. and then that will slow your shutter speed down from the 128 default. Then you can change the size of the hole that light gets in through, the aperture size, which is measured. The unit of measurement for aperture size is f-stop. 8 is the kind of middle of the road number. Something like 1.2 is your prime lens that's massively wide open, and then you've got f16, which everyone knows about because it's something to do with the Sunny 16 rule. But generally speaking, if your aperture doesn't make any difference in Daz Studio, because the aperture of the camera is virtual and it doesn't do what you want it to do. You can change the camera settings specifically in the cameras themselves, but f-stop will adjust the amount of light getting into the sensor, and I use that, that's all sort of in speech marks. It adjusts the amount of light, but it doesn't create any bokeh, so you don't really want to mess with that setting. I mean, you can, it's not going to have any effect other than making the image brighter or darker. And then film ISO, again, even the use of the term film ISO shows you that it's an attempt to emulate DSLR. How accurate it is debatable, but again, so at the moment it's 100. You can change that to make it brighter. You just increase this number to 200, 400, 800, 1600, 3200, and so on to increase it. Vignetting is fairly self-explanatory. You can add vignetting to the outside of the image. You can adjust the white point and increase the... This is essentially kind of post-processing happening in camera. I generally would avoid messing with these, to be honest. Change these settings if you want to, the f-stop, the ISO, and the shutter speed. But to be honest, all of this other stuff is stuff that you're better off doing in post. You don't want to mess with any of these things that are going to take detail out of your image. Essentially, you should be lighting and rendering your images so there is as much detail as physically possible, so that you can then take them into post and edit them and adjust them as much as you want to. So those are the three things that are going to change the brightness of your image, or you can just move the EV, the exposure value, up and down. It has the same effect. You can increase the EV to brighten the image, decrease the EV to darken the image. Nice and simple. Next up is environment, and this one is the one that has the most properties in it. And this is the one that confuses the most people. So let's look at environment mode. At the moment we've got it set to dome and scene. That means that if we have a sky dome or a HDRI lighting our image, then the light from that will be included in our render, as well as any lights that we have within our scene. So for example, any lamps or any softboxes or any light sources within our scene will also be included. I can change that to dome only, so that my scene lights, any light sources that I have in the scene, will not illuminate anything. I can also change it to scene only, so that there is no sky dome. And as you can see, when I switch to scene only, loads of the properties just vanished and disappeared. And then there's sun sky only. Again, if you're really sort of getting to grips with Daz Studio, I would advise you against using sun and sky, because it has really limited purposes. Generally speaking, if you want to save time and money and memory, just use dome and scene. Use a sky dome for your outside lights, and then add light sources as you need them to. Then you can change your dome mode from infinite sphere to infinite sphere with ground, finite sphere with ground, finite box with ground. Depending on the HDRI map that you're using for your sky dome will determine which one of these you use. Suffice to say that infinite sphere means that you can keep going in one direction and you will never reach the edge of the sphere. Finite sphere means that it has dimensions, i.e. if you were to go too far in one direction, then you would eventually go outside of the sphere. So generally speaking, leave it on infinite sphere or infinite sphere with ground if you're using one of those depth of field compatible HDRIs, but I wouldn't worry too much about that right now. Now, draw dome. Self-explanatory. It's either going to draw the dome or it's not. As you can see at the moment, we have this. This is the Daz Studio's default HDRI. And if I were to turn this on, it would include that in our render in the background. It wouldn't look anywhere near like that. It would be a small fraction of it. But essentially, you can turn that on and off. Environment intensity and environment map. These are the line between these two is fairly blurred, in so much as if I were to increase either one of these numbers, the brightness of the light from our environment map would in fact increase. And if I were to reduce either one of these numbers, it would decrease. They're multiplied together to give us the light from the HDRI. So have a little bit of a play around with those and see, you can get different and interesting effects from them. Realistically, it could take me a while to explain the relationship between the two properly, but just suffice to say that if you increase either one of these two numbers, your HDRI is going to get brighter. If you decrease either of the numbers, they get darker. Then you can change environment tint, i.e. at the moment it's white. It's 255, 255, 255, or 1.0, 1.0, 1.0, depending on if you're talking in hex or in decimal. And what that essentially does mean that at the moment there is no color cast, no hue or tint applied to the HDRI. If I was to make this slightly green, then it would apply a green tint to this HDRI, which has its uses, believe it or not. This is actually really useful for creating night scenes without changing your HDRI. Environment light resolution, again, it's not a setting, to be honest, that I've ever played with. Honestly, these two, the light resolution and the lighting blur, are two settings that you just want to leave alone. Let them get on with it. Let them do what they want to do. Dome orientation X, Y, and Z means the rotation or the position on each one of those axes. So you can orient it further to the left or to the right or up and down. You can then rotate it around the y-axis by using dome rotation, which is useful if you want your light source in your HDRI to be coming from a specific direction. Ground texture scale, again, I don't even really mess with that. You can change the ground's position. Daz Studio will have I don't want to call it transparent, but it's basically an invisible ground that all of your objects will be casting shadows on. And you can turn its position into auto, which means it's pretty much always going to be at 0. Oops. Or you can set it to manual and then you can actually adjust the height. But generally speaking, just leave it on auto. I tend to avoid using the ground because I rarely use an HDRI without anything else in the scene. However, if you were doing that, if you had an HDRI from a scene and you didn't want to put a ground plane in, you can just use draw ground and it will show the shadows of the characters as they stand on it, basically. So you can, assuming you position your camera very carefully, make it look like the characters are actually standing inside the HDRI. Ground reflectivity, glossiness, shadow intensity, and ground visible from below. Those should all be fairly self-explanatory. At the moment, I have no reflection on the ground. It's set to 000. However, if I was to crank that up to 111, then the ground would be very reflective. You could change the glossiness of it. The shadow intensity, adjusts how dark the shadows are going to be on the ground that you have turned on or off. And then ground visible from below means that if your camera currently, with draw ground set on, if your camera drops below 0 on the y-axis, you won't actually be able to see anything because the ground will be obstructing your view. So you want to turn that off and then you can see up, so you can shoot from below the character. And then matte fog, it allows you to put a depth fog in the scene. However, again, generally speaking, I wouldn't bother because you can do that in post and it's just more effective. Things that you're going to be interested in here. As you can see, in both photoreal and interactive mode, I have CPU turned off and I'm only using my RTX 3080. And as you can see at the bottom, I have allow CPU fallback turned off. I have allow GPU detection turned on and I'll check GPU driver version turned on. But I've actually turned off CPU fallback because if I have created a scene that my GPU physically doesn't have enough memory to render, I don't want my CPU to take over and try. What I want is for Daz Studio to tell me I've used too much memory so that I can do something about it. One of the things that I can do is I can change the threshold of my texture compression. Texture compression basically means the size at which my texture compression will kick in. So I have it set to 10,000 for medium. For some reason I've got it set to high at 2,000, but it seems to be working, so I'm not going to bother changing it. And those are the settings on this screen that you're going to be worried about. And the other thing that you're going to be interested in is canvases. However, canvases is a topic for a whole nother video, and I have done a video on canvases before, so feel free to check that one out as well. Thanks very much for watching that, guys. I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think in the comments below, I'm sure you will, and I will see you in the next one. But until then, you take damn good care of yourselves, alright? Bye bye.